3 armed thugs thought they had an easy target in a rainy alleyway. They didn't count on the 68-year-old grandfather watching from across the street. In 60 seconds, bones shattered, and the attackers were left bleeding on the asphalt. But the real shock came 3 days later, when a 2-star general knocked on his door. Christian Vance was just a mechanic. At least that was the lie he had lived for the past 22 years. At 68, his knuckles were swollen with arthritis, his silver hair was thinning, and his daily routine consisted of black coffee, fixing carburetors at his small garage in South Boston, and taking care of his 8-year-old grandson, Leo. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. A bitter Atlantic wind whipped through the streets, carrying the scent of salt and impending rain. Christian and Leo were walking home from O'Malley's Pizzeria, a cardboard box warming Christian's calloused hands. Leo, bundled in a puffy yellow jacket, was excitedly recounting a comic book he'd read that day. Christian listened with a gentle half-smile, his limp a souvenir from a piece of shrapnel in the Korengal Valley that the VA hospital never quite fixed, making his gait uneven. To anyone passing by, they were the picture of harmless working-class domesticity. An old man and his boy. Then the screams started. It wasn't a theatrical movie-like scream. It was the sharp, breathless gasp of pure terror, immediately muffled. Christian stopped. Decades of dormant instincts, buried under years of oil grease and quiet suburban living, flared to life in a fraction of a second. The hairs on his forearms stood up. "Grandpa?" Leo asked, his voice trembling as he noticed the sudden, terrifying shift in Christian's posture. Christian's faded blue eyes darted toward a narrow, dimly lit alley, sandwiched between a closed laundromat and a boarded-up brick tenement. Beneath the flickering orange glow of a dying sodium street lamp, 3 men had cornered a young woman. She was pinned against the damp brick, her trench coat torn at the shoulder. One man had his hand clamped over her mouth. Another was pressing the serrated edge of a hunting knife against her ribs. The third, a hulking brute in a leather jacket, was tearing through her leather briefcase, tossing files into the puddles. It wasn't a standard mugging. Muggers in this neighborhood wanted cash phones and jewelry, and they wanted it fast. They didn't meticulously sort through documents. "Grandpa." Leo tugged at Christian's flannel sleeve, his wide eyes welling with tears. "Grandpa, help that lady." Christian looked down at his grandson, his heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear, but from the familiar, icy rush of adrenaline. He had spent 2 decades trying to forget the man he used to be. Staff Sergeant Vance, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. He had promised his late wife he was done with the violence. He had promised himself. But he couldn't unhear Leo's plea, and he couldn't unsee the blade pressing into the woman's side. "Leo Christian," said his voice, dropping an octave, stripping away the gentle grandfather and leaving only the operator. "Take the pizza. Go behind that green dumpster on the corner. Close your eyes and count to 100. Do not open them until I say your name. Do you understand?" Leo swallowed hard, took the box, and ran to the dumpster. Christian turned back to the alley. He didn't run. Running wasted energy and alerted targets. He walked his footsteps completely silent, despite his heavy work boots. The arthritis in his knees seemed to evaporate, replaced by a cold, calculated fluidity. As he stepped into the shadow of the alley, the brute, rifling through the briefcase, looked up. He sneered, seeing only a limping old man in a faded flannel shirt. "Get lost, old-timer," the brute barked, reaching into his jacket. "Unless you want to bleed." "Let her go," Christian said. His tone was perfectly flat. "Dead." The man holding the knife laughed. "Check out Clint Eastwood. Hey, Ricky, teach this fossil a lesson." Ricky the Brute pulled a heavy steel pipe from his jacket and lunged at Christian, swinging it in a wide amateurish arc aimed right at Christian's skull. In Christian's mind, time slowed to a crawl. The swing was telegraphed, sloppy, and overcommitted. Christian didn't just dodge, he stepped into the attack. He slipped inside the arc of the pipe, bringing his left forearm up to block Ricky's bicep, neutralizing the momentum. Simultaneously, Christian's right hand shot forward, the heel of his palm striking Ricky directly in the trachea with the force of a piston. Ricky didn't scream. He couldn't. His eyes bulged as his airway collapsed, and he dropped to the wet asphalt, clutching his throat, his lips turning blue. The alley went dead silent, save for the patter of freezing rain. The other two attackers froze their brains, failing to compute how a fragile old man had just incapacitated their enforcer in less than 2 seconds. The man holding the woman's mouth dropped his hand and reached for a weapon, but Christian was already moving. He closed the distance with terrifying speed. The knife wielder lunged, thrusting the blade at Christian's gut. Christian pivoted on his good leg, grabbed the man's wrist, applied a brutal rotational lock, and snapped the joint. The crack echoed off the brick walls like a gunshot. The man shrieked, dropping the knife, but Christian wasn't done. He drove his knee squarely into the man's floating ribs, feeling 3 of them cave in, sending him sprawling into the garbage cans. The final man, the one who had been holding the woman, panicked. He pulled a suppressed 9mm pistol from his waistband. Suppressed. Christian thought, analyzing the threat instantly. Professional hit. Before the man could raise the barrel, Christian scooped up the dropped steel pipe with his toe, kicked it up into his hand, and hurled it like a javelin. It caught the gunman square in the bridge of the nose. Blood exploded in a crimson mist. The man stumbled backward, dropping the gun. Christian closed the final gap, grabbed the man by the collar of his jacket, and slammed the back of his skull into the brick wall. The man went limp, sliding down into the puddles like a discarded rag doll. Total elapsed time, 48 seconds. Christian stood breathing steadily, the cold rain mixing with the sweat on his brow. He looked at the 3 bodies groaning and twitching on the ground. Then he looked at the woman. She was in her late 20s, shivering violently, her mascara running down her pale cheeks. She stared at Christian as if he were a ghost. "Are you injured?" Christian asked, his voice returning to its normal gravelly cadence. No, she stammered, pulling her torn coat around her. "Who? What are you?" Christian didn't answer. He bent down, picked up her scattered files, noticing they were covered in heavy black redaction markers, and government seals, stuffed them back into her briefcase, and handed it to her. "Leave," Christian ordered. "Don't go to the local precinct. Go straight to a federal building. Now." Without waiting for her to respond, Christian turned his back on her and walked out of the alley. He found Leo crouched behind the dumpster, eyes squeezed shut, counting. 87, 88. "Leo," Christian said softly. Leo opened his eyes and scrambled up, hugging Christian's leg. "Is the lady okay, Grandpa?" "She's fine, kiddo." Christian lied, his heart aching as he picked up the cold pizza box. "Let's go home. Don't tell your mother about this, all right? It'll be our secret." For 3 days, Christian waited for the sirens. He hardly slept. He sat in his worn armchair by the living room window, a mug of cold coffee in one hand, and a disassembled Colt M 1911 on the side table, watching the quiet suburban street through the slats of the blinds. He checked the local news compulsively. Nothing. Not a single report of 3 men severely beaten in a South Boston alleyway. No police tape. No leaked hospital records. That terrified Christian more than if the police had kicked his door down. Cops meant the system was working. Silence meant the system had been bypassed. It meant whoever those men worked for had cleaned up the mess quietly. Suppressed weapons, government files. Christian cursed himself. He had promised his late wife he would stay out of the shadows. Now he had waded right back into the deep end, and he had dragged his family's safety down with him. On Thursday morning, Christian's daughter Sarah dropped Leo off at school and headed to her shift at the hospital. Christian was alone out in the front yard, wrestling with a stubborn spark plug on his lawnmower just to keep his hands busy. The autumn air was crisp and painfully quiet. Then the quiet broke. A convoy of 3 matte black Chevrolet Suburbans with heavily tinted windows rolled in unison down Elm Street, their run-flat tires crunching ominously on the fallen leaves. They didn't park on the street. They pulled aggressively onto Christian's driveway, boxing him in. Christian slowly placed his wrench on the hood of the lawnmower. He stood up, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. His eyes scanned the vehicles, heavily armored. The doors opened simultaneously, and 8 men in civilian suits stepped out. They moved with the synchronized lethal grace of Secret Service or high-tier private military contractors. But it was the man who stepped out of the middle vehicle that made Christian's blood run cold. Dressed in the immaculate green Class A uniform of the United States Army, with silver stars on his epaulets, was Major General David Arrington. Christian hadn't seen him in 25 years, not since a classified debriefing room in a black site in Eastern Europe. Arrington walked up the driveway, his cold grey eyes sizing up the older man in the stained overalls. "You're a hard man to find, Staff Sergeant," Arrington said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "I'm a mechanic," Christian replied, not moving an inch. "And you're trespassing on private property." Arrington offered a thin, humorless smile. Still got the edge. "Christian Vance. Fake name. Fake life. You built a nice little fiction for yourself here. Got a grandson, too. Leo, isn't it?" Christian's entire body went rigid. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. "If you or your men go anywhere near my grandson." Christian whispered, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly register. "I will kill every single man on this driveway, and I will save you for last." The suited men shifted hands, drifting instinctively toward their jackets. Arrington raised a single finger, freezing them in place. "Stand down," Arrington ordered. He looked back at Christian, the iron facade finally cracking to reveal a bone-deep exhaustion. "I'm not here to threaten your family, Christian. I'm here because you saved mine. The woman in the alley on Tuesday night, Clara. She's my niece." Christian frowned, processing the information. She was carrying classified documents and targeted by professionals. Who was she running from? Arrington sighed heavily, scanning the rooftops. "Clara is an investigative auditor for the Department of Defense. 6 months ago, I assigned her to look into a massive discrepancy in black budget logistics. Millions of dollars of off-the-books hardware disappearing in the Middle East. Someone inside the Pentagon is brokering the deals. Clara found the encrypted ledger, proving who it is. Those men in the alley were sent by a private military contractor, Apex Vanguard, to retrieve the ledger and put a bullet in her brain." Arrington took a step closer. "When my team recovered, Clara, she said, an old man with a limp, dismantled 3 Tier 1 operators in under a minute. There are only a handful of men alive who can do that. The ledger she found is currently locked in a secure server room at a decommissioned naval base on the harbor where we are trying to crack its encryption. But Apex Vanguard is mobilizing. They are sending a kill squad tonight to wipe the servers." Christian shook his head. "I've done my time in hell, David. Find someone else." "You don't have a choice," Arrington replied grimly. "They ran facial recognition from an ATM camera across the street from that alley. Apex Vanguard knows who you are. They know about Sarah, and they know about Leo. If they get that ledger back tonight and clear their names tomorrow morning, they will send a team to this house to tie up loose ends. Christian stood frozen. The wrench remained on the lawnmower. The quiet life was over. The lie was dead. He looked at his home filled with Leo's drawings and memories of a peaceful life, then back at the General. He let the dirty rag fall to the concrete. "When do we leave?" Christian asked. The decommissioned naval annex on the edge of Boston Harbor was a graveyard of rusted steel and forgotten conflicts. Rain battered the corrugated iron roof in relentless sheets, masking the sound of the Atlantic, crashing against the concrete pylons below. Inside the facility smelled of ozone, damp earth, and old oil. In the center of a windowless bunker once used for submarine communications, Clara frantically typed lines of code into a ruggedized terminal. The server racks hummed, casting a sickly pale blue light across her exhausted face. The decryption progress bar hovered at 74%. "They're taking too long to break," Clara muttered, her fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. "The encryption is military-grade AES 256. If they hit the primary power grid, the servers will wipe automatically." General Arrington racked the slide of his Sig Sauer P320. Beside him stood two loyalist soldiers, Corporal Jenkins and Sergeant Miller, both gripping M4 carbines with white-knuckle intensity. "Just keep working, Clara," Arrington said grimly. "We hold this room until that bar hits 100. Across the bunker, sitting on an overturned ammunition crate, Christian Vance was deep in a ritual he hadn't performed in over 2 decades. He had stripped off his mechanic's overalls and now wore a charcoal tactical sweater and dark cargo pants. On his lap rested a heavily modified matte black Remington 870 pump-action shotgun. Arrington had offered him the best modern weaponry the DoD had to offer: thermal optics, laser-aiming modules, suppressed submachine guns. Christian had refused them all. "Technology fails when you need it." "Most, David." Christian had said, methodically, loading double-aught buckshot into the Remington's tubular magazine. "I prefer things that don't need batteries." Christian checked his gear one last time. Primary Remington, 8.7, O loaded with double, O buckshot. Second area, standard issue Colt M, 1911, sidearm tucked into a Kydex hip holster. Melee a carbon steel KA bar combat knife sheathed on his tactical belt. Utility 3. M84 stun grenades and a spool of high-tensile tripwire. A sudden sharp static burst crackled over Corporal Jenkins's radio, followed by dead silence. "General," Jenkins whispered, his eyes wide. "The perimeter sensors just went dark. All of them. Simultaneously." "They're here," Arrington grunted. Christian stood up the shotgun, resting comfortably against his shoulder. His arthritis, his limp, his age, they all seemed to vanish, buried beneath a cold, terrifying focus. He walked toward the heavy steel door of the server room. "Lock this door behind me." Christian commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. "Do not open it for anyone but me. If the handle turns, and it's not my voice, shoot through the metal." "Christian!" Arrington called out, his stern face softening for a fraction of a second. "There are at least 15 Tier 1 operators out there. You're one man." Christian didn't look back. "I'm not a man, David. I'm a ghost, and ghosts love the dark." He stepped out into the labyrinthine corridors of the naval base. Behind him, the heavy steel deadbolts slammed shut. Christian moved to the main electrical breaker panel at the end of the hall. He didn't just pull the lever, he took his KA bar and slashed the primary conduits, showering the corridor in violent blue sparks. The entire facility plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. Outside the facility, Commander Thomas Reed of Apex Vanguard raised his hand. 15 heavily armed mercenaries clad in advanced tactical gear and quad-node panoramic night vision goggles, NVGs, halted in the pouring rain. "Power's cut," Reed barked into his comms. "They're trying to blind us. Switch to thermal and infrared. Breach team, blow the main loading dock doors. We sweep and clear. Nobody leaves this facility breathing. Retrieve the ledger." Boom! The explosive breaching charge ripped the rusted loading dock doors off their hinges, sending smoke and debris billowing into the rain. The Apex operators poured into the facility, moving with predatory synchronized precision. Their laser sights sliced through the dusty air like green spider webs. They expected a barricade. They expected a terrified security detail. They did not expect the Korangal Valley. Christian crouched in the rafters of the primary warehouse, breathing shallowly through his nose. He watched the glowing green lasers sweep the floor below. They were relying entirely on their night vision. It was a fatal mistake. The point man moved past a stack of rusted shipping containers. His boot snagged a nearly invisible high-tensile tripwire. Clink. An M84 stun grenade dropped from the ceiling directly into the center of the squad. "Flashbang," the point man screamed. At 3 million candela and 170 decibels, the stun grenade detonated. To the men wearing light-amplifying night vision goggles, the flash was catastrophic. The phosphorus flare overloaded their optics, blinding the front 5 operators instantly. They screamed, clawing at their helmets as their retinas burned. Christian dropped from the rafters like a shadow. He didn't fire the shotgun, it was too loud for close-quarters stealth. He landed behind a blinded operator, clamped a hand over the man's mouth, and drove the KA bar cleanly into the gap between his ceramic body armor and helmet. The man went limp. Christian lowered him silently to the concrete. The smoke from the flashbang hadn't even cleared before Christian moved to the next target. He grabbed the barrel of an operator's assault rifle, forced it upward, and struck the man in the throat with the steel pommel of his knife. 2 down. Contact, front. One of the rear guards shouted, firing wildly into the smoke. Christian melted back into the shadows behind the shipping containers. The mercenaries fired blindly, the deafening roar of automatic weapons echoing off the metal walls, tearing into empty space. "Cease fire!" Commander Reed roared over the comms. "Form a perimeter. Where is the target?" I don't know, sir," a panicked mercenary replied, adjusting his thermal goggles. "He's not on thermals. It's like he doesn't have a heat signature." Christian had spent the last 20 minutes caking his clothes and exposed skin in freezing mud from the harbor bank, masking his thermal output just enough to blend in with the damp, ambient temperature of the freezing warehouse. He pumped the Remington 870. The metallic clack-clack echoed through the massive room. In the pitch black, the sound was psychologically devastating. It came from everywhere and nowhere. "Spread out," Reed ordered, his voice betraying a hint of panic. "Find him." Christian engaged. He stepped out from the flank, leveled the shotgun, and fired. The roar of the 12-gauge was thunderous. The blast caught 2 operators in the chest, the kinetic force lifting them off their feet and slamming them into the drywall. Before the others could pivot, Christian was gone again, relocating with terrifying speed. He was dismantling a squad of elite killers using nothing but the environment psychological warfare and raw, unforgiving brutality. Inside the server bunker, the gunshots were muffled but rhythmic. General Arrington watched the heavy steel door. Beside him, Clara typed furiously. 92%, Uncle David." Clara breathed sweat dripping from her chin. "Almost there." Suddenly, A massive explosion rocked the bunker. Dust rained from the ceiling. Apex Vanguard hadn't put all their men in the warehouse. A secondary breach team had flanked around the exterior and blown a hole straight through the southern concrete wall of the server room. Smoke poured into the room. Sergeant Miller raised his M4, but a suppressed 3-round burst cut him down instantly. "Return fire!" Arrington shouted, diving behind the server racks as bullets tore through the computer monitors, showering the room in glass and sparks. Corporal Jenkins fired wildly into the smoke before a sniper round caught him in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Through the dust, Commander Reed stepped into the bunker, flanked by 3 heavily armored men. Reed wiped the concrete dust from his visor and leveled his rifle at Arrington, who was bleeding from a graze wound on his cheek. "General Arrington." Reed said, his voice distorted through his helmet's comms unit. "It's over. Step away from the terminal." Reed Arrington snarled, recognizing the voice. "You sold out your country for a private paycheck." "Patriotism doesn't pay the mortgage, General," Reed sneered. "Now where's the old man?" "Right behind you." Reed spun around. Christian Vance stood in the shattered doorway, bleeding from a cut above his eye, his chest heaving. His shotgun was empty, hanging by its sling. Reed laughed a harsh metallic sound. He lowered his rifle slightly. "So this is the boogeyman, the guy who took out my warehouse team. You're just a broken old mechanic." 98%, Clara shouted from the floor, shielding her laptop with her body. "Kill them both," Reed ordered his men. Before the mercenaries could raise their weapons, Christian drew the Colt M1911 with blinding speed. Bang, bang, bang. 3 shots perfectly placed. The 3 mercenaries dropped to the floor, armor-piercing rounds finding the weak points in their visors. Reed snarled, tossing his rifle aside and drawing a serrated combat knife from his chest rig. "You want to do this the hard way, old man? Fine." Reed lunged. He was fast, fueled by adrenaline and youth. He slashed at Christian's face. Christian leaned back, the blade missing his eye by a millimeter, and parried the follow-up thrust with his left forearm. The impact sent a jolt of agonizing pain through Christian's arthritic joints, but he didn't flinch. Christian trapped Reed's arm, twisting it outward, and drove a brutal knee into Reed's abdomen. Reed gasped, but retaliated, headbutting Christian squarely in the nose. Christian staggered back, blood pouring down his face, his vision swimming. "You're too old for this," Reed mocked, advancing. "Your time passed a long time ago." Reed thrust the knife toward Christian's heart. Christian didn't dodge. He sidestepped slightly, letting the blade slice through his tactical sweater and bite into his side. Using Reed's forward momentum against him, Christian grabbed the back of Reed's neck, pivoted his hips, and executed a flawless hip throw. Reed slammed into the concrete floor with bone-shattering force, dropping the knife. Before Reed could recover, Christian was on him. He drove a heavy combat boot into Reed's elbow, snapping it instantly. Reed screamed in agony. Christian reached down, grabbed Reed by the tactical vest and hauled him up just enough to deliver a devastating fight-ending right cross to the mercenary's jaw. Reed's eyes rolled back, and he slumped heavily to the floor, unconscious. Silence fell over the bunker, broken only by the hum of the servers and Christian's ragged breathing. He clutched his bleeding side, his knees finally buckling as he leaned against the cold concrete wall. 100%, Clara cried out, slamming the enter key. On the massive monitor above them, a prompt appeared. Transmission secure. Destination Joint Chiefs of Staff. Status delivered. Arrington let out a long, shaky breath and lowered his weapon. He looked around the devastated room, then at Christian, who was slowly wrapping a tourniquet around his bleeding side. "It's done," Arrington said, his voice thick with emotion. The traitor at the Pentagon will be arrested by dawn. Apex Vanguard is finished. Christian looked at the unconscious men on the floor, then up at the general. And my family, untouchable. Arrington promised. I'll have a permanent security detail on your street totally off the books. And your records, they'll remain buried. Christian Vance, the mechanic, is perfectly safe. Christian nodded slowly, the fierce, deadly light in his eyes finally dimming, replaced once again by the quiet exhaustion of an old man. 2 days later, the sun was shining brightly over South Boston. Christian sat on his front porch, a bandage concealed beneath his thick flannel shirt. The smell of freshly cut grass filled the air. In the driveway, his grandson Leo was drawing an elaborate spaceship with blue sidewalk chalk. "Hey, Grandpa!" Leo called out, looking up with a bright smile. "Do you think spaceships have to get their oil changed like cars do?" Christian took a slow sip of his black coffee, watching a black, unmarked sedan parked discreetly down the street. The men inside didn't look his way, but Christian knew they were there. Watching. Protecting. He looked back at his grandson, a genuine warm smile spreading across his weathered face. "I reckon they do, Leo." Christian chuckled softly. "Everything needs a little fixing up now and then. If you enjoyed this pulse-pounding, true-to-life story of a grandfather's hidden past, make sure to hit that like button. Stories like Christian's prove that true heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they wear flannel shirts and hold the line when no one else will. Share this video with someone who loves an incredible comeback story, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more thrilling, action-packed tales delivered right to your feed.